are so fortunate today to have as our speaker and wonderful friend, Nell Seymour Toensmann. Did I say your last name incorrectly again?
Close, close. My mother never learned to pronounce it.
Oh, good. That makes me feel better. And I'm going to call her Nell, although we say Nell, because that's how I grew up knowing her. I've known Nell since I was born, since my first recollections, because her incredible father came to Trinity when I was, I believe, 6 months old. I was an infant, so I knew no other rector of Trinity until he left when I was 16 or 17 or something. And so I remember all kinds of wonderful things about Nell, the choir. Trinity was our world, and we all lived downtown and walked to church and hung around there all the time. And so should I wait? Anyway, enough about my memories of Nell, which are wonderful. I was so delighted to connect with her. And the first time I saw her, because she lived in Germany after they got. Did you go to Europe before you got married and married over there?
Got married. Well, met my husband, was married in Paris, France, and lived in 3 different countries in Europe over 32 years. And then I brought him here in 2004 after my father died. So
there was a long period in which we had not seen each other. And then at a diocesan convention at Camp Weed, there, and this is pre-St. Cyprian's, Nell, I might add. I was at St. John's, Tallahassee, the other wonderful parish or church, I should say, in our diocese. And there she was, set up at a table with fair trade things, and we had the first time I'd seen her in a million years. So that was a fun reunion. And she's going to talk today about the Reverend Charles Seymour. We always called him Mr. Seymour in the olden days. Our parents called him Charlie. And there's quite a story. So I will turn this over to her, and thank you so much for making the time to join this group, which has fed my soul over the last few months. So I will turn it over to you.
And thank you, Melinda, for organizing it. I think this is wonderful to see so many people that are interested in talking about what was happening in St. Augustine in 1963, 64, and those very violent years. I will admit that at the time this was all happening, I was in New York. I went up to, after 2 years of college, I took a summer job in New York where my older brother Charles got me a summer job, and I got off the train from South Carolina to New York, fell in love with New York, and stayed 8.5 years. So when this was taking place, I was not as aware of what was really happening in St. Augustine. But I will just say this, and I'll refer back to it later. On June 21st, 1964, on the day that my father admitted African Americans to services at Trinity, I was there. That weekend, one of my good friends, Pat Gant, had gotten married and asked me to be godmother to her son. And so I flew down from New York. And on Saturday night, my father got a phone call that said, "Mr. Seymour, we're coming tomorrow." And he said, "You will be welcome." And he and Stanley Bullock, who was the associate at that time, who had just started working, began his ministry at Trinity April 1st, 1964, bringing his wife Kay and young children. And I think she may have even been expecting another child at the time. So that is the day that it happened, but I'm going to give you some background information. My father was born in Tennessee on July 10th, 1910. He would be 110 years old right now. I do have some information that I can email to Melinda or Mary Beth or somebody if she can send it out to everybody else. That I put together for the dedication of Trinity Hall in 2005. It is information I compiled for the bishop, Bishop Howard, who would not have known my father very well, if he would have known him, but certainly in his later years, when he was not the same person he had been earlier. As we all know, sometimes with aging, the memory can, impact the person that you are. I put this together so that he would have an understanding of the role my father had played when at Trinity, sort of a little bit of the history, but certainly a lot of the events that were around that, because the courtyard at Trinity was dedicated to my father. Specifically, the doors going into Trinity Hall, and there is a plaque there that is there that you can see. My brother, some of you may know, but probably not everybody, Goody Seymour and his wife Mary are the ones who are now taking care of the garden in the courtyard at Trinity. He's a staunch Trinity person, and I'm a staunch St. Cyprian's person, and happy to be here. So some of the things that had happened, you know a lot of the history because you've been reading the book. You probably have read some of the other books because there are at least 5 that are talking about this period. In Dan Warren's book, it doesn't talk really much about my father. But during this time, there were many efforts to integrate at Trinity, as there were at many of the other white mainstream Protestant, especially Protestant churches. The vestry members at the time would basically be the ushers. The vestry was the ushers, and they were all men way back then. They would lock the side doors, the side door that goes on to King Street. They might even lock the front door to keep anybody from coming in that they felt should not be there, especially if they were African American. My father was not aware of this because he would be having 2, sometimes 3 services on a Sunday morning. The first one being communion, the second one being a children's service, the third one being the more adult service. So he would go in, process in the front, would have the service. At the end of the service, he would leave, go back, refresh himself, prepare for the next service. And that would happen for whether it's two services or 3 services during the day. He was not aware that there were people trying to enter. And even Barbara Vickers told me one time when I was talking to her, she said, yes, we came in and sat down at Trinity. And the vestry members came up to us and basically said, if we did not leave immediately, that physical harm would come to us. So they were not just threatening anything, they were threatening physical harm against anybody that tried to integrate. So this had been happening, all the other events that had been happening, I'm sure that you've read about, the swim-ins out at the beach, the Monson motel, swim-in there where people came in. There were all the marches, everything that was going on. And during this time, one of the nice things was that when Stanley Bullock had arrived in St. Augustine, one of the things he did, and I only learned about this more recently, he would scout around the property at the church. He would look behind the bushes and he would find, rods and sticks and anything that could be used as ammunition that some of the KKK or the anti-racists might be hiding there that they could use as weapons. He was the person that was talking to the police. He was the one that was reaching out into the community. He was the one that was as much of a buffer that could be at Trinity at that time because of the fact he was the associate and not the rector. And there were things that he could do certainly as a younger priest, that my father would not necessarily have been doing, where my father was more representative. But he was working against a vestry that was very racist. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So I mentioned that there were many attempts to integrate the church, but I have to give you a little bit of background. What I have behind me is a triptych that I put together before the dedication of Trinity Hall. I have others that talked about the physical part of what my father did during the 15 and a half years that he was at Trinity on the physical side, because most of the stained glass windows that are there were installed during that time or were begun during that time and ended. He went through a big building program that Melinda might remember, the tall 3-story Henry Hall. Certainly Sandra would remember as well, where you had several different, you had 3 different stories, and that's where all of the community things took place. Then they did a little side building that was the first Henry Hall off to the side, that gave us sort of a first floor opportunity for social functions to happen. And then there was a huge building program that basically created what is now the structure at Trinity now, with all the building, the sort of the Spanish motifs that is done. All of that was done during the time my father was rector. So he had a very influential time during that time. Certainly he understood the needs of the parish and he looked for them. I don't know whether Melinda might remember, Sandra might remember, in what was originally the parking lot before the buildings came in, they would do a fair every year. And there might be a pony rise, there might be other things, and there would be white elephants and all kinds of stuff. And these were fundraisers for the church. So these were things that were just a part of the community at Trinity. And yes, it was a time when we spent a lot of time there. We had our youth groups that might meet on a Sunday evening. And there were just a lot of things that were happening. So then we're going into the whole integration thing. In January of 1961, and I have a newspaper article that's right up here. And basically, it talks about the fact that the Diocese of Florida, which at that time went all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast, all the way over to Pensacola. And there were only 2 dioceses. There was the Diocese of Florida and the Diocese of South Florida. Now there are currently 5 dioceses, to give you an idea how much Florida has grown. But the bishop, whether it was Bishop Juan or Bishop West, would have to go 400 miles from Jacksonville without interstate to go, and then he might do several visitations on the way over and back and have services that were not necessarily on a Sunday, so that they could do visitations at the different churches. So you had one diocese, and they met. During that meeting, they voted unanimously to move towards integration. The national church had already had a special general convention under a presiding bishop from the South, I believe probably Mississippi, who then called to try and get all of the churches to general convention, then voted that they would be moving towards integration. In the Diocese of Florida, 1961, not 64, 61, they voted unanimously to move towards integration. So the diocese had already said, this is what we want. How are we going to move towards it? I even remember a little video that was being shown, and it was about stars and stripes. And this was being shown to our young people. And it was about 2 puppets, that one had stripes and the other had stars. And it was being as an allegory about differences and accepting other people that were different or things that were different than you, and why that was important. So the church had been reaching out in many ways to try and help people to understand that there are differences and we have to be accepting of differences. but it was just something that could be said in a very simple way to help people to understand that there are differences and we need to be more accepting of it. So then we're going into, during that year, there are a number of things that happened. You probably read about Mrs. Peabody, who came to St. Augustine. Well, I've got a very funny story about that. As I said, I lived in Europe for 32 years. I was very involved with the Episcopal Church there. I was lucky that there was either an Episcopal Church or a Church of England everywhere I lived, and we did move up more than a few times. As I said, 3 different countries in Europe. Well, in the year 2000, our Bishop Rothorn, who was probably one of my very favorite bishops, did what he called Mission 2000. So he brought together all of our churches. We went down to the south of France. We stayed at a very modest place. It used to be a Roman Catholic seminary, right? Just happened to be on the water, but you know, it was great. And we had a meeting there, and he brought in people from the States and people from other worlds. And one of the people that was there was a French priest, Episcopal priest, who was in Massachusetts, and he was connected with the seminary there. So we ended up sitting next to each other at lunch one day. And so you just, you know, you're introducing yourself and how are you? And well, I grew up in St. Augustine, Florida. And his reaction stunned me. He said, I hate that place. I said, what are you talking about? How can you hate St. Augustine? He said, because when I was in Massachusetts, as you know, Mrs. Peabody was married to the bishop and the mother of the governor of Massachusetts. Anyway, so when Mrs. Peabody, who would do whatever she wanted anyway, went down to St. Augustine, the bishop contacted him and said, please, can you go to St. Augustine, keep her out of jail? So what happened? He went to St. Augustine. He ended up in jail with Mrs. Peabody. So I tried to explain to him, and I told him about the whole role about my father and all the rest of it. But you never know who you're going to meet, where you're going to meet, and, you know, the stories that you hear. So anyway, so that is just another story. So Mrs. Peabody did come down. At that time, you would have Easter service, but you'd also have a service on the Monday and the Tuesday following Easter. And there were also, before Easter, you would have something pretty much every single day honoring, you know, the Lent and, you know, and the week before Easter and everything that's going on. When she came down, the vestry members knew about this. They locked the doors. Once again, locked the doors of the church. So Mrs. Peabody did go in and talk to my father. And they did have conversations. The service was canceled. You can't, I did go on a walking tour where I was participating, and they came to Trinity and they said, yes. And Mrs. Peabody came, and the pastor there, said, we don't allow Negroes here. And I went ballistic, as you can imagine, because she's talking about my father. And I kept trying to say, excuse me, that my father would never have said that. You do not have the correct information. I said, I'm talking about my father that you are trying to say, put words in his mouth. Well, it ultimately ended up costing me a job with the Tour St. Augustine as a result of that particular outburst. But you know something, you know, I feel you need to stand up for what's right, and that's what happened with my father. So you have all these incidences where they're trying to integrate around St. Augustine. You have all the marches that are going on. You have the focus on St. Augustine in a way that you never had when you've got, you know, all the major networks, there were only major networks then, you know, ABC, NBC, CBS. And you had reporters from the New York Times and everybody else who would be there in St. Augustine, following all the events and things that were going in the press. So I fly down to New York on June 19th. My parents meet me at the airport. Saturday night, we are out at the beach house. During the summer, there is a property at the beach that my parents bought as a summer house because the rectory was down on the corner of Bridge Street and St. George Street. The Catholic Church owns that property now. It is now, I think, probably used as a parking lot. But this is where I grew up. So during the summer, when the weather got hotter and you didn't have air conditioning, and you would have houses that were built where you could open a lot of windows and hope the air would come through, and you'd have an attic fan that would dry and circulate the air. We would go out to the beach where we could open the windows out there and at least get some cooler air. So we were out at the beach, the phone rings, and it was one of the organizers who said, Mr. Seymour, we're coming tomorrow. And my father did try and encourage them to go to the earlier service. They said, no, we are coming to the later service. And he said, and you will be welcome. So being prepared, at least to know that prior to the service, and I have to admit, my mother and I came in a separate car. And for some reason, we got there after they had been admitted. And my mother always sat in the back pew anyway. And very often our dog Andy was there with us. But when we came into the church, they had already been seated. Now, the people that came, one of them was Henry Stiles, who was a Haitian Episcopal priest. So he was not dark skin. He was a lighter skin, African descent. Several women and several girls were there who came to attend the service. At that time, it was a morning prayer because we were only doing communion once a month before they went to. And most of the people in the congregation were not even aware that there were any African Americans who were seated in the congregation. As soon as the recession, as soon as my father and Stanley and the recession took place, here I am. I'm this New Yorker now, and I'm going to go and talk to them. Well, the next thing you know, they were out the door before I even turned around. And the only picture that you've got of that is them exiting the church. It's the only picture I have even found. It's right there. I have this available that if anybody wants to see it, but it is, and I will, if you go to large screen, you might be able to better see what's back here. But basically, you can see Henry here. You can see some of the girls, and you can see the women. You can see my father. My father is a bald one. The taller one is Stanley, mostly bald. And Stanley Bullock, who was a big 6.5 foot tall guy. Exiting the church. Well, also, the press had been notified that they were going to be there. You had the KKK across the street. You had there was just a lot going on. And as soon as they exited, they were put in a car and out of there. But that's when it all hit the fan. So then you had the vestry, who then decided that, they already had not been happy with the National Council of Churches. They wanted to cancel the National Episcopal Church. They wanted to cancel their funding to that. They didn't do anything about it, but they were threatening it. And then all of a sudden, the vestry meets and they form a letter. And so in the letter, I have a copy of the, I can read to you. Okay. Okay. To the clergy of the Diocese of Florida, this is for your information. At 4 p.m. Tuesday, June 23rd, so that's 2 days after it happened, in the parish house of Trinity Church, St. Augustine, the vestry of Trinity Church presented to the Reverend Charles Seymour, Rector, the following letter. During the past several months, it has been most apparent that policy decisions between the vestry of Trinity and yourself have been in direct conflict. On several occasions, you have found it necessary to directly oppose and subordinate the decisions of the members of your vestry. We find this direct conflict of interest cannot continue and that therefore your immediate resignation should be accepted. Adequate consideration will be given to your needs of time for an appropriate move for yourself and family. We respectfully request a prompt reply. Sincerely. And some people might recognize the name of A.H. Thibault Jr., Secretary of the Vestry, Opie Thibault, who was the publisher of the St. Augustine Record. Okay. The vestry, and there, let's see, invoke Canon 46, requesting the good offices of the bishop. Let's see, do I have the right pages? Okay, I think I've got them in the right order. Okay. On July 1st, the bishop met with the vestry. Having prepared for mailing the following letter to the rector, the bishop took it in person and read it to the rector in the presence of the vestry. Now, remember, 1961, the diocese moved towards integration. Okay. This is to acknowledge the receipt of a copy of the letter to you, signed by the secretary of the vestry of Trinity Church, informing you that the vestrymen have voted 9-1 to express to you their willingness to accept, if tendered, your resignation. We are informed that this action of the vestry came after you, as a vested clergyman, ready to lead the congregation in divine worship, personally escorted certain persons presenting themselves for admittance to this service into the body of the church. I am also informed that they participate in the service in an orderly and well-behaved manner. This is to let you know that the Diocese of Florida thoroughly approved your action in that capacity and in that way. If there is to be any economic threat to your security, we have already set up a minister's relief fund to receive contributions first from the clergy out of their salaries to take care of your needs. This will continue as long as seems advisable. It has been reported to us that vestrymen of Trinity Church St. Augustine in the past few months have locked the doors of the front church door of the church without approval of the rector immediately prior to a scheduled service, locked the side door of the church without the approval of the rector immediately prior to a scheduled service, approached certain persons sitting in the pews ready for a service, telling these persons that their attendance was not desired and that those persons were not to return, approached certain persons at the door of the church or on the steps of the church or on the church walk or on the sidewalk in front of the church, informing them that their attendance was not desired at divine service, using obscene or unseemly language to persons of the congregation and others at or about the time of divine service, and having absented themselves in whole or in part from divine service, though they were at or near church property at the time of divine service. These actions, or any one of them, are true. It is conduct unbecoming a vestryman. It is a direct transgression of the godly admonition of the bishop expressed in person to the vestry. It is contrary to the rubrics, canons, traditions, custom, and usages in the doctrine, discipline, and worship of the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. We are inclined to believe that individual vestrymen have been subjected to great emotional strain and stress during the past weeks of civil strife and commotion. Outside influences have created upsetting upheavals within normal patterns of life. This may have temporarily blurred the vision of certain vestrymen as to where their real loyalty lies. Their ultimate loyalty must be to Jesus Christ, our Lord, through his church. We do trust that you will find some way to let each vestryman know that the church will continue to use all due patience and constraint and love in the exercise of this administration, that each vestryman is accountable to the church here and to the great shepherd of souls hereafter for his actions, and that continued disregard for and violation of the rubric, canons, traditions, customs, and usages in the doctrine, discipline, and worship of the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America could possibly end for each such vestryman in suspension or excommunication, or both. It is our hope that the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ will cause each vestryman to turn to the Lord of all, that the love of God will claim each vestryman for himself, and that the fellowship of the Holy Ghost will guide each vestryman into the truth and faith of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Let it be unequivocally and unmistakably clear that the doctrine, discipline, and worship of the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America will be upheld. Sincerely yours, Hamilton West, Bishop of Florida. Resignation from the vestry were offered by the junior warden, Major Kenneth Barrett, the clerk, Mr. A.H. Thibault, and by Mr. William Craig, and were accepted by the bishop. Bishop West stood firmly behind his priest and the actions that was taken. Earlier, my father had made the statement, and it's all in here, that with what was happening, it is possible that he and or other clergy in St. Augustine might no longer have a future in St. Augustine. This was true of the Presbyterian pastor who had asked his, I guess they called the synod, to integrate, and within a few months he was gone. I'm still not sure exactly why, but he was, after a few months, he was no longer there. As for my father,
Nell, you're on mute. You accidentally muted.
oops, sorry. Am I
I'm
back?
sorry. I muted everybody. I'm sorry, and I also muted you by mistake. So it's all.
So where did I stop? What did you hear last?
A sentence, just a sentence.
Okay, so basically what I was saying is that my father at that point knew that his ministry, after 15 and a half years at Trinity. Now, you don't hear that very often these days. In the olden days, it was more common that the clergy would come and would stay an extended time. But my father also knew, I'm just going to throw in something. He was offered a position in North Carolina at the end of my sophomore year, which that would have been 1959, to go to Durham, North Carolina. He refused that offer. I kept saying, oh, gee, that would be great, to move. Why don't we do it? And the reason he did is he felt that because we had grown up in St. Augustine, this is where our friends were, this is where our history was growing up, that he felt it was important that he stay at Trinity until we had all graduated. I graduated in 61, my younger brother Goody graduated in 62, and Charles had graduated in 58. So he was looking at from the family aspect, and he also knew that there were certain things that he had accomplished, wanted to complete accomplishing at Trinity with everything he was doing. So all of a sudden, he is forced into the position of, what is my next move? One of the things that we discovered somewhat later and somehow has walked away from the family, and I'm trying to find out which brother might have it, were letters that came to my father during the period from April through September, from bishops, from presiding bishops, from clergy, from personal friends, and everybody, basically congratulating him. We're here for you. What can we do? Basically supporting him in every way with what was happening and what they could do for him. Unfortunately, I didn't make photocopies of all of them before the two folders went from one brother to another, and they both claim they don't have it, but I know I don't have it. So this is really history. It's something that I would like to find again. Just because I do want to compile a lot of information about my father and the role he played. So here we are. It's the summer of 64. What next? people that had been friends of my parents for many years would, if they saw them on the street, would walk to the other side of the street. I am sure at that time, people were probably more happy to have Stanley Bullock take services than my father. It was a very, very difficult time. It was a very difficult time in St. Augustine, and Sandra could probably give you a little more history about how even when they were supposed to have set up some kind of a process for the Africans, Americans, and the whites to meet together, when they finally met, there was a secretary to record the information and no one on the side of the white residents to meet with the African Americans. Even Martin Luther King Jr. has said St. Augustine was the most difficult place that he ever tried to integrate. We still see results of that today. We see there's still a lot of racism here. And it has come out in many, many different ways. But so we're back in the summer of '64. My father reached out, other people reached out to him, and he was offered to be the associate rector of Trinity Church in the Garden District of New Orleans. The Garden District, New Orleans, okay. So he accepted that position. And they ended up going through with the move to leave St. Augustine. They went through a hurricane in St. Augustine. They arrived in New Orleans. There is a hurricane in New Orleans awaiting them. And at one point, my mother said, "We're here at a hotel. We could at least be unpacking, at the apartment." And they had an apartment that was, the bottom floor of a house, really, really nice. It was right on St. Charles Avenue. And if you know New Orleans at all, St. Charles Avenue is wonderful. And it was just a short distance from the church and the Garden District. I have to admit that I flew down to New Orleans a number of times for Mardi Gras parades and lots of other festivities. It was great for me to be able to join my parents there. So my father goes there, and Canon Turner was the rector there. And this is a congregation of about 2,000 people. So this is a big jump up from Trinity that was hundreds of people to 2,000 people. And also, if you sort of understand the Southern culture and even New Orleans culture, is kind of like people would walk up to my mother and say things like, "I bet you don't know who I am." It was a very different transition. They were there for 7 years. Soon after my father arrived, somebody came up to Canon Turner and said, "Well, that Seymour fellow, you know what he did in St. Augustine?" And he replied, "I know what he did. That's why I asked him to come here." And one of the things that we came across later with some of Papa's things was the church had a school. They always had the private schools so that the nice white kids didn't have to go to school with the African Americans with the integration. So the private schools became very popular. We came across something where my father was recommending several students to be admitted to school in New Orleans. The interesting thing is we don't really know what happened with that, but this is one of the things he was tasked with. Now, a few years after my father arrived, Canon Turner had to retire for health reasons. My father became the rector there. But New Orleans, being sort of the really social place that it was, and the Episcopal Church certainly at that time was the social place to be. I mean, it was in St. Augustine. It certainly was there. It became something that my father just realized that this is not where I should be. My ministry should not be catering to 2,000 people that are living in the wealthiest part of New Orleans, that, et cetera. And then he submitted his resignation. The bishop said, please take some time off, which he did. My parents traveled a bit. And then they went they were assigned a congregation in Lake Providence, Louisiana, which was small, sort of a farming community, a big lake where everybody would have their pontoon boat and go out on the boat and have parties and things like that. And he went there, but he also ended up becoming the dean of the convocation, which meant he was reaching out to all of the churches in that region within the diocese. He also was and had been put on earlier on the board of trustees for Sewanee, the University of the South, where he had gone to seminary at St. Luke's. And my older brother had attended 1 year at St. Andrews. He got sent off because his grades weren't good 1 year. So he went up to St. Andrews, and then he went to college at Sewanee for 3 years. So he was on the board of trustees representing Louisiana, because Sewanee is owned by all of the southern dioceses. So he played a big role, especially working with the bishop on many different things until the time he retired. Now, the retirement took place coming back to St. Augustine in 1979. And one of the reasons for that is the fact that that was also the 40th anniversary of my parents' marriage. And it was like, where are we going to celebrate? Where are we going to be able to come together to have a celebration? Goody was living in St. Augustine, Charles and Helen in New Jersey. I was in Europe. My parents in Lake Providence, which was not the easiest place for us to get to. And it was kind of like, okay, why don't we do it in St. Augustine? And the beach house was still there. So the idea was, okay, we're going to renovate the beach house, make it into a year-round home, and then my parents moved there. So that's exactly what happened. So it became it sort of their anniversary celebration, sort of with the impetus to come back to St. Augustine. The reception they got coming back was very mixed. Occasionally you would have somebody come up and say, the nerve of you coming back to St. Augustine after what you did 15 years later. Okay, people hold grudges. And other people that came up and said, we are so sorry for what we did back then. And my father later, was made rector emeritus at Trinity. They were welcomed back in, and they began to establish their lives there, back here. My father also took on a number of roles as an interim priest. And as a matter of fact, I was very lucky when I lived in Brussels, Belgium. We had the Anglican Church, Church of England was downtown Brussels. The Episcopal Church was out in Waterloo, which from my house was like 35 minutes away. So I mostly was going to, because my kids were young, was going to the Anglican Church, which was 5 minutes from where I lived. And all of a sudden, they needed an interim priest in Waterloo to be able to take services, etc. And I'm talking to the bishop and to the archdeacon at the Pro Cathedral down in Brussels. I said, well, my father's a retired Episcopal priest. He would certainly be able to do that. Well, the bishop at the time reached out to Bishop Tharp for some reason, who was the retired bishop of East Tennessee, because that's where my father had started, East Tennessee, Knoxville. I said, do you know Charlie Seymour? Well, yes, I do. And he said, well, what if he were to come over and be the interim rector? He said, you'll be lucky to have him. So my parents came over, and for 3 or 4 months had an apartment at the Anglican Church, had a use of a car, and took services out in Waterloo. It also gave them an opportunity to travel during the week, to be around, and to also spend time with my children, who at that point were younger. 4 years later, the rector who was there basically is leaving. my father came back for another 3 or 4 months to Waterloo, Brussels, which was really wonderful for us to be able to have family time together. So this was, nice things. But he went back to Louisiana. He did, I think he was in Lake Charles for one. He did interims all around. He would do special services. And I have another story. He would go up and do the Wednesday healing service at the cathedral. And I'm trying to remember what her name is. One of the Trinity people, I might come to the name, who would always go to the healing service because she was working in Jacksonville. So she'd go to the healing service on Wednesday. And she said, I want you to know your father was doing the healing service. And this guy came in with something very serious that was obvious, that you could see. And he came in to do a healing. He said, your father did the healing. And he came back next week and he was healed. She said, I think he performed a miracle. And I'm going, what? So it's always nice to hear the good and positive things about somebody. And my father was also somebody who held a lot of things in. In other words, as a priest, there's so many things that we know that with Ted, so many things that you hear and then you absorb and you absorb and you absorb. But you can't go around talking to other people about it. You might have one person who's your confidant during that time, but otherwise you just can't do it. My father never talked to me about what happened in 1964. He never talked to me about what he was going through. My mother would talk and allude to it, and it was very hurtful. It was very hurtful to both of them for what was happening. But, the thing is that he did what was right. He did not go out to be a martyr. He did not go out to say, he was not out there protesting. He was not out there leading the charge. But when the time came, he did what was the right thing, which we all hope that we can do in our own lives. But I don't know. I just know that I was very blessed to have the Reverend Charles Milne Seymour Jr. as my father. And I'll give you one other little anecdote about why I felt I was so blessed. I lived in a number of different places and found Episcopal churches everywhere. And at the Church of Ascension, Munich, Germany, we ended up in a interim without an interim. And I ended up as senior warden. And we had an interim up through Christmas. And then all of a sudden in January, there was a lay vicar who was appointed, and me. So we ended up reaching out to extra clergy around the diocese. Could you come to do a Sunday when we didn't have somebody? We worked a lot with the bishop as well. And we didn't have somebody who would do a morning prayer. Now I just spoke. But during the time, a number of women came and said, we want to have a women's group. We want to be able to meet. So we just started meeting on Wednesday at, 10 o'clock or so. And then after we would meet for an hour or two, we'd go out and have lunch together. So it just became a regular thing. So Len Parto, who's a very, very spiritual person, said, oh, I have a book that we can use. And it's basically looking at the Lord's Prayer. Well, I want you to know we never went through the book because we got to the part that said, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And the story started gushing out. None of the other women could look at look at God as a father figure. Nobody. They had fathers that were abusive. They had fathers that put them down all the time. There were fathers that had the wrong expectations for them. Not one of them could think of God as a father. That shocked me to no end. Because when I think of God as a father, I can think about my father with love. They were not able to do that. What's interesting is that there was a lot that came out of that group. We ended up also with one woman who had had not only an issue with her father, but with her German husband. She was American. We helped her to go to what is the equivalent of the Betty Griffin house, to leave her husband, because she had the support of the women in that group. So, wow. Anyway, so yeah, many people think of priests as father figures. I mean, many do. Many don't think of that at all. We now have the women priests that we can think of mother figures, and we can think of God as a mother. But this would, let's see, we were in Munich from 93 to 99. So this was well over 20 years ago that this was going on, was happening. But it just, it's just amazing to me. We all come with our own stories. We all have our own representations of a higher being. And we all come from very different paths, to get to where we are. So, yeah, as I said, that was just something that just totally shocked me, that there were so many people out there with just these relationships with their father, where I just thought everybody's father was, great to their kids. And that wasn't the case at all.
No,
Mary Beth?
it's so touching. It's almost 11, but do you have time to take questions from anyone?
Oh, absolutely. Sure.
So if you have something, just please unmute yourself.
Sandra?
Everyone is muted. So you need to unmute if you have a question, please.
Sandra, you're not muted.
All right,
Oh, there she is. Yeah.
Shift Command A.
Oh, now you just muted yourself again. You should be able to click in the picture. There you are. Yeah. You did it again.
No, I'm,
Okay,
There. Okay.
are you hearing me?
Yes. Yes.
I just wanted to point out two incidents that I think are important. One is that in the early 60s, the city of St. Augustine began to undertake what was called the restoration. The area in which I lived on North St. George Street had become almost a slum by that time. My family's hotel was in the middle of it. But when the community selected individuals that were going to advise this commission about how to go about restoring downtown St. Augustine, the Reverend Charles Seymour and my father were roommates on a trip to Williamsburg, Virginia, to study how we should go about doing this. So the Reverend Seymour was respected in the community well beyond Trinity Episcopal Church, because the community, saw in him, my impression of him was such a dignified, thoughtful person. And that was the kind of influence in the community that the Restoration Commission wanted. The second comment has to do with Hoopy T-Bolt, who was on the vestry. Nell, do you recall who else was on the vestry? My point is, if you take the 5 most important influential people in St. Augustine, it would be Herbert E. Wolf as number 1, but Hoopy T-Bolt, as the publisher of the record, was clearly one of the 5. And that a person of that influence in the community, to be turning against your father like that. Who else was on the vestry besides Ken Barrett's father was at the Arsenal, so he was a respected person. Who else was on the vestry then that would have?
Well, the Art Fisher was on the vestry. Art was probably the one person that just a second. Art was probably the one person that Papa could confide in. Art and Pat Fisher, I'm not sure if Pat's still around or not, but Art worked in the insurance business, and he was just right there on King Street. And he later became senior warden. At one point, he was senior warden with my father, but he was somebody that my father could talk to. In terms of that, Jimmy Alexander was on the vestry. Jimmy Alexander, a few years later, had a heart attack and died. You know, the Ranch House restaurant that Emmy took over when people said, oh, a woman doesn't run a restaurant. She ran it and then started the White Lion, which I think at least one of her sons is running now. She is one of the people that profusely apologized to my parents and really reached out to them. I'm sure that if I look through other things, I could probably find a list of who was on the vestry. But it would have been all men at the time. I think it was only much later that a woman was actually asked to serve on the vestry. But I can see what I can find. Sandra, there are papers everywhere. I'm just, as you might understand, yeah.
The point is that these were leaders in the community. I mean, these were not inconsequential people who were simply duped by Hardgrove and by, you know,
Dr. Trice, yeah.
Dr. Trice and the prevailing view in the town at the time was that the Episcopal Church was infiltrated by communists, and that the civil rights movement was a communist effort. So that people of that standing were so easily influenced. It's a cautionary tale to all of us, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you're a small community, a small town, you can be a big fish. And, you know, yeah, exactly. Now, Hugh, you had a question?
Now, I wanted, in your reading, did I hear you say there was a vote 9-1? Was that the vestry voting against your dad?
That's right.
So there was one vestry man.
That would have been Art Fisher.
Art Fisher. My mother
That would
always
have
said,
been Art Fisher.
she always said Art Fisher was a saint. That's what Mama always said.
Amen.
And I remember that even though I was 15 or 16, I guess at the time, I remember there was Art Fisher who stood by your father.
He and Pat actually was very often was playing secretary at the office. She was doing a lot of administrative stuff at the office as well, even afterwards. But yeah.
And by the way, while I'm not muted, I do have a list of who was on the vestry. I happened to I found a bulletin from a Sunday. It may have been in April, not in June.
And it had all the vestry members.
It had all the vestrymen listed. And because Cindy had said to me one time, Rahara down there at the bottom, and Beth, hey, Beth. Cindy,
Beth, yeah.
She said, and Marilyn Morris said the same thing to me. Oh God, I hope my father wasn't on the vestry. I think he might have been. Oh no. And Cindy said the same thing. They weren't. Neither one of them was on the vestry during that time. But I can find it. I stuck it somewhere. I'll find it and I'll get that list.
I have several other triptychs, and that may be on one of the other triptychs, but I just put this one out to say, anyway, just so you can see it. I did give a presentation to the Cyprian women one time when our faithful leaders were not available, and I jumped in and I went through all the different triptychs that were there, ending up with this part. So anyway, Barbara, you had a question.
Yeah, I moved here in 2008 and we checked out Trinity, went there for about a month, and you were there, and if I remember correctly, you would wheel in a wheelchair?
My mother.
Your mother, okay. So
my mother insisted. We moved back here. My father died April 15th, 2004. He died 1 week before what would have been their wedding anniversary, which would have been their 65th wedding anniversary. and 2 weeks before the anniversary of his ordination. So April was a very big month for my father, with weddings and ordination. When I came, we came over in April, and we were using frequent flyer mileage, so we came right after Easter to be able to spend time with my parents and spend a few weeks. We arrived on Thursday. My brother picked us up at the airport, took us immediately to Samantha Wilson. My father was there. He had been taken to the hospital a while earlier because of neurological balance issues. And I had been over here in February and spent time with my parents. I did not realize that he was about to die. I mean, Goody didn't say anything. It's all of a sudden we walk in and it's kind of like, oh my God. We were here for his death. One of the things I have to say something about my father. My father belonged to a club in high school that was, I think, called the Club 11 or something. They organized dances, big band dances in high school. Being in Knoxville, Tennessee, going to the University of Tennessee, the group just continued. They organized their dances. And even at one point, we found something that said, a heading, son of wealth, jazz singer to be ordained. And I'm going, Papa, did you really sing? He said, well, yeah, I guess. He was also one of the people that would sing. They would earn extra money with this. But my father always loved big band music. And to go to bed at night, he would take records. I mean, the disc. He would stack them up on a record player, and one after the other, he would play. It didn't matter that I gave him a CD player with CDs of the big, no, he had to have the record. That's how he would go to sleep at night. So when we came in, when I knew that he was at Samantha Wilson, I said to Charles and Goody, because Charles had been around was around too, bring Papa his music. Papa has to have his music. So we come in on the Thursday evening, we see Papa, we come back the next day, we bring my husband's computer, we bring the CDs, we bring speakers, which I'd insisted he brought over with him. And for the last 4 hours of his life, he listened to his music.
And then did you come over to St. Cyprian's after your mother died?
So we moved here. So we were at a point where the company my husband was working with was going to be liquidated. One bank buys another bank, and then the insurance company buys the big bank and then makes decisions about the little bank. And all of a sudden, his job is being terminated. So it was a question of, okay, we've got some time now. My German husband needed a green card. He needed to go through the whole immigration process. So we decide early on after our April visit and the funeral and everything else, we go back, and it's like my mother, we convinced her to go to be a permanent resident at the pavilion at Bayview, which meant that the house out at the beach was available. So I talked to both my brothers and I said, what if I come over to help Mother? Great idea. Goody was the one who lives here, who was always at beck and call of parents to do this, to do that, to take the doctors, to do everything. They could, how soon can you come? Well, we went through the process, and Henny got his green card. We actually knew somebody in the immigration process in Frankfurt, so that helped. So in August, we flew over. So from the time I arrived, I took over the day-to-day stuff with my mother. We went to Trinity. I even became a lay reader at Trinity. I vested as a chalice bearer at Trinity. I did Episcopal Relief and Development.
I did table of something.
I did Hope, the Project Hope or whatever out of Ecuador. I did a lot of stuff. I even did stewardship one year. So yes, I got very involved at Trinity. But my mother always wanted to go to Trinity. Now, in the meantime, things were changing at St. Cyprian's while she was still alive. And that's when the congregation decided to up and become, eventually the American mission, Anglican mission in America. Pastor Dina took over, on an interim basis. My mother, I want you to know, my mother paid for, I don't know how many hymnals, and you will see the dedication to my father in there. She paid for the bulletin inserts for a whole year for that. She was there. Dina knew that she could ask and that my mother would be helpful. The nice thing is, even though my father was an Episcopal priest all that year, didn't earn enough money, he did inherit some stocks from his father, which grew and basically provided a nice little extra base of income for my parents. My mother passed away in December of 2008.
Oh,
Our idea was we're going to come over. It might be a year. We downsized. We put our stuff in storage in Frankfurt and came over here, shipped a few things over so we'd have personal things and lived at the beach house. And basically my main job was to take care of her, which I did. But then all of a sudden I'm old enough to go on Medicare and I'm old enough to get my Social Security. And part of the deal was because I was in Europe all those years, my mother, I wasn't paid to do anything, but she paid for my Social Security. So it got me up to the 10 years, which is nice. I can see a little bit of money there. So then we went through several incidences with her where, she had a fall and she had this and, was she going to make it? We had Dina ready to get last rites at momentarily. She passed away in December, unfortunately too close to Christmas because there were a number of people that were not available for the funeral. But at that point, we had decided we were going to stay in St. Augustine rather than going back to Europe. And of course, your children move to different places. And, if we go back, let's see, they're in Amsterdam. Well, the Netherlands is not really where our home has been. So Henning decided he liked all the sun and the fact you could walk on the beach and you didn't have super cold winters. And so we made the decision to stay here. The one thing that I have to say is that my mother was able to vote in the 2008 election. And she was thrilled that she could vote for Barack Obama. So anyway, so my mother died in December. Probably Pastor Dina had come in and sort of taken over at St. Cyprian's. And then you had some other people, what was his name? Who
yes.
ended up, pardon?
I'm trying to think of his name.
Yeah, he ended up going to Canon and the thing, and then Ted came in. So he was there for about a year and a half. So after my mother died, within about a month, I started coming to St. Cyprian's when there were maybe 10 or 12, maybe 20 people in the congregation. Because I felt that with all my years in the involvement in the Episcopal Church, and I was also a deputy to General Convention 4 times, an alternate 1 time from Europe, and an alternate from Florida, that I could be of more use at St. Cyprian's than just another body over at Trinity. They had the bulk. St. Cyprian's needed to be built up, and that's why I started coming over here. But
Mary
my
Beth,
mother,
is that when you came too, about that time?
No, I didn't come to Trinity for another 3 or 4
No,
years.
no, I mean St. Cyprian.
I didn't come to St. Cyprian's for another 3.
Oh, okay, because I kind of remember the two of you kind of coming about the same time.
yeah, well, it was a different world back then, but St. Cyprian's has certainly grown to be an absolutely wonderful place. But yeah, no, that's
And while you were sharing, I remember thinking to myself, I'm sitting here thinking to myself, how lucky you were to have had your dad. And then you mentioned knowing people that couldn't relate to Father God because of their father. And I was sitting here thinking how different my faith story would be if I could think of Father God. And, I can't either.
But with so many people, it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate, that we're in that place.
Yeah.
But
Just have to redefine it.
yeah, well, one of the things that we like to say is that my father was one of 8, actually 9, because one of the boys right in the middle died at a very young age of whatever disease was going around. He was one of 4 brothers. There were 4 sisters. They all lived to be a pretty ripe old age, which is really incredible. And that what's even more incredible is that the 4 women died before any of the men, the brothers. And the 2 older women and my father, then another woman, then more brothers and another, sort of interspersed in there. And the youngest was like 14 years younger than my father. And he died a few years ago, the youngest one did. But the family, he grew up in a loving family that opened their doors. They lived on Melrose Place in Knoxville, Tennessee, which is a street that sort of goes uphill. It's like a big circle and comes downhill. And they were right up at the top of the circle. From their front porch, you looked out at University. It was either probably dormitories or, class buildings or something, but the university ultimately bought their property. But you could just look, you could walk to the university. You could actually walk to the football stadium from their house, if you wanted a nice little hike. So they were just right in the middle of all of this. Their doors were always open. They never knew how many people to fix for dinner because they didn't know which child was going to be bringing home somebody to eat with them. And at one point, one of the fraternity houses burned down, and it might have been when one of them was in college. The whole fraternity stayed at their house. And this is what you just didn't know. My grandfather was a lawyer. My grandmother, as somebody in the family said, well, yeah, she would have a child, and then she'd go back to doing her volunteer stuff. And then 2 years later, she'd have another child and go back to doing her volunteer stuff. She did a lot of things. I am named after her. She was Florinell Gloucester Seymour. When I have acolyted, some of you may have seen a silver cross that I might have worn.
Mm-hmm.
That was given to my grandmother in 1938 for her work with the Episcopal women's group in Knoxville. And it's absolutely beautiful. But it is something that I got to receive because I was her namesake. But they, I'll tell you a story about my grandparents dying, because this is rather incredible. So on a Sunday in 1958, my father gets a phone call from his brother, and I'm saying, oh, well, Papa's relaxing. No, get your father on the phone. Their father had died. He had for more than a year, he had several years, he had some health issues and was mostly homebound with nursing care that would come in. So on the Sunday, we learned that my grandfather died. On Monday, we are driving to Knoxville for the funeral that's going to take place on Wednesday. So it's a 2-day journey, no interstate, up through the mountain passes and everything. So we arrive on Tuesday. My parents stay at my grandparents' house. I am off with one of my cousins, Susan. And on Wednesday morning, Aunt Jane comes in to say, your grandmother died.
Mm.
So, I'm sorry. This is the day of the funeral. So the funeral was going to be Wednesday morning. They moved it to the afternoon. They sent some of my cousins down to the church to tell everybody who came for the funeral to come back later. My grandmother had picked out all of the hymns. They were all Easter hymns. My father realized that they ended up having both of the caskets in the church. My father knew that the pole in Knoxville, Tennessee, that there was a similar identical pole in one of the churches in Memphis where he had been associate rector before going to South Carolina, before coming here. One of the lawyers had flown his private plane over, sent the pilot back to Memphis to get the call, to bring it back. The church was full. There were people out the door. Because of the role that both of my grandparents had played in Knoxville. They had been on wards all over the place. They had done everything to make it a better community.
How
Now-
lucky you are.
But
to
this
have
is
that.
the family that my father was raised in.
Mhm.
And that's why he became the person that he was.
Nell, did your father ever talk about his call to the ordained ministry? Was there a moment that he would talk about?
He credits Bishop, well, would have been, what was his first name? Bishop. He became Bishop Melcher. I think his first name was John, I'm not sure. He was the rector at in Knoxville. Oh, what's the name of the church? I know. He was I have that information right here. I printed it off somewhere else. Okay. He had been the St. John's, Knoxville. He had been the rector there when my father was at a specific age. He had encouraged my father, whether an acolyte, he was somebody that my father admired tremendously. I think he was the person who became the primary influence for him to become a priest. He ended up, after graduating from the University of Tennessee, he went to St. Luke's at Sewanee, did his 3 years there and graduated in 1935. Then went to Memphis, and he was at 2 churches there. There's a funny story about what happened the day he arrived. So he takes the train over to Memphis. He gets off the train, and the senior warden meets him at the train and says, "Oh, guess what? You have a funeral today, and tomorrow you have to do a radio station thing because the rector is in the hospital." So he came right out of seminary, right out of being ordained as a deacon, and he had to jump in with both feet, and he had to do, and so it was several days before he came back, but all of a sudden he was the one that had to just come in and take over, immediately. But he had a few interesting stories. Also, during the time he was in Memphis, he came down with malaria, and they sent him back to be with his parents during that time. And then he went back over. So, there are lots of stories. We even heard one story about, my father, all of a sudden, when his parents were out of town or something, he just decided to go visit a cousin or an uncle somewhere else, didn't tell anybody. I'm like, "Oh, yeah? You did that, Papa?" "Yeah, I just wanted to see him."
I love that you call him Papa. It's so cute.
Well, my grandfather was poor Papa, and he became Papa, and my mother became Lady. So they were Lady and Papa.
Okay.
They became Lady and Papa. So that's how, the grandchildren all got to know him. Yeah, Carol Ann.
Now, I have to thank you so much for this. Has been the most inspiring hour and a half of my year, this COVID cloud.
Yeah.
And if you wait long enough, you may meet someone that that fills a hole. And for you, it may not be a big one, but for me, this is huge. I have always been around abusive men. My father, my brother, both of my husbands, my 2 sons. And I latched on to, as Barbara put it, Father God. So I turned that on its head because I'm the opposite of what your experience was, because it gave me hope and safety. And now I know in my 70s that's why I've taken every reading and everything so literally, because I wanted it to be stable. And again, there are no coincidences. your influence now brought me to St. Cyprian's because I came to the Democratic headquarters and I was churchless at the time because I had to leave a Lutheran church in St. Augustine, and your influence brought me there, and I have been filled up, you know, it's almost like to the brim, but more just keeps coming in. So this has been the best of my Christmas season. Thank you.
Now, you come from such a long lineage of people with deep integrity. And your stories today certainly explain to me how you became the person you are, because I have looked up to you since I've met you. And you do so much for the church and the community and the country. And so we just thank you for being willing to take your time and do this. God bless you.
Thank you. You're very kind.